She showed up in the desert wearing a wedding dress, with no one waiting at the altar. What would you do if your entire life fit inside a weather-worn suitcase? And the only road ahead led to a stranger's door. Eliza Mae Harlan thought she was starting a new chapter as a bride, a partner, a woman with a future. But what she found was betrayal, dust, and silence. Miles from home, heartbroken and penniless, she had no map, no plan, and nowhere else to go. When she stumbled upon Jacob Whitmore's quiet ranch in the Arizona wilds, both their lives were steeped in sorrow, shaped by loss, and held together by routine. They didn't expect company, they didn't ask for it, but sometimes the soul finds shelter where the body first finds rest. This isn't just a story about survival. It's about two broken hearts learning how to breathe again. It's about what happens when love grows slowly between silences, over coffee, and through seasons of waiting. If you've ever wondered what it means to truly belong, this story will stay with you. If this touched something in you, leave a comment, subscribe, and share this story with someone who needs it. Now, let's begin with a man and his silence. Some silences don't ask to be broken. They settle deep into your bones, like dust in an old saddle. In the high country of northern Arizona, where the canyon winds hummed low and the red earth cracked beneath the weight of time, Jacob Whitmore lived alone. His cabin stood like a weathered thought against the backdrop of towering pines and sandstone cliffs, quiet, steady, and resigned. Jacob was 47 years old, though the years sat heavier on him than most. His beard, once chestnut brown, had silvered at the edges. His hands, thick with calluses, still knew the reins, the rifle, and the rhythm of a life spent not needing much and expecting even less. He was not bitter, just quiet, like the land. Each morning began the same way. Up before the sun, he'd boil water on the wood stove, grind his beans with the same hand-crank mill his father once used, and sip his coffee from a dented tin mug by the east-facing window. He never added sugar. Sweetness had left his life a long time ago. Outside, the world moved slowly. Horses in the corral shifted their weight and snorted into the cold air. The barn's hinges creaked like old bones. Jacob would walk the fence line before breakfast, a rifle slung casually across his back, not out of fear, just habit. Coyotes, maybe, or a stray cougar if the season was bad. There were no neighbors close by. The nearest homestead was a full day's ride, and Jacob preferred it that way. He didn't need conversation to fill the spaces. The land spoke in subtler tones, hoofbeats on dry soil, the soft rustle of cottonwood leaves, the whisper of his late wife's memory in the corner of every room. Her name had been Clara. She had died 10 winters ago, taken by the kind of fever that didn't care how young or beautiful you were. Jacob had buried her beneath the lone juniper tree behind the house, the one that bloomed lavender berries when spring was generous. He still visited the grave, sometimes with words, sometimes with silence. He had built a life around her absence. The house remained tidy, though not for anyone in particular. The table was always set for one. A quilt she had sewn still lay folded at the foot of their bed, its edges fraying but intact. The world outside had changed, but Jacob had chosen not to. That afternoon, as he saddled up his bay mare, Maggie, for a routine check along the southern fence, the wind shifted. It wasn't a breeze. It was heavy, thick with dust and warning, the kind of wind that came with silence just before a scream. He looked west and saw the sky darken not with clouds, but with sand. A wall of copper-colored air rose from the horizon like a judgment. Jacob knew desert storms, knew how they moved, how fast they turned a clear sky into a blindness. "Come on, girl," he said, tugging Maggie back toward the stable. By the time he latched the barn doors and secured the shutters, the storm had reached him. Grit swept through the gaps in the wood, scouring everything it touched. He ducked inside, lit the lantern, and waited. The house groaned under the pressure, dust curling into corners like smoke. For hours, the world was reduced to noise, howling, slamming. the rattling breath of a land that had seen too much dryness and too many years. Then, as quickly as it had come, it passed. The wind fell still. The dust settled into a fine layer across the floorboards. The silence returned, but this time, it felt different. Not like before, not like the silence he knew. He poured another cup of coffee, still warm on the stove, and stepped out onto the porch, brushing the grit from his coat. The air was thick, but calm. The sky above, flushed orange by the setting sun, began to clear, and then he heard it, a distant rhythm, not the soft shuffle of his horses, not the groan of the wind or the flap of loose canvas. This was foreign, intentional, hoofbeats, slow, uneven, like someone who didn't know quite where they were going, but was determined to get there anyway. Jacob stiffened. In this part of the country, unexpected company meant only a few things, and most of them weren't good. He set his coffee down, reached for the rifle leaning just inside the doorway, and stepped off the porch. The hoofbeats grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls. Not a full gallop, more like a tired trot. One horse. Maybe a pack animal, two. He squinted into the fading light, dust still lingering in the air like memory. Then he saw a silhouette crest the far ridge. Rider slumped forward, wide-brimmed hat, a long coat flapping against the horse's flanks. But something about the figure didn't match. The frame was smaller, shoulders narrower, and then it hit him. It wasn't a man, it was a woman, alone, in a storm-beaten saddle, heading straight for his gate. Jacob gripped his rifle tighter, not in fear, but in disbelief, because whatever was about to happen next, he hadn't seen it coming. She wore white once, but now dust had claimed her like the desert claims everything. From the edge of the ridge, the rider emerged like a ghost conjured by wind and memory. Her hat hung low over her face, its brim sagging from heat and use. The long coat she wore, once ivory, by the look of its seams was now the color of sand and smoke. Her horse moved as if it, too, had forgotten what purpose looked like, its legs trembling with each step toward the cabin. Jacob held his rifle loosely, barrel tilted toward the ground, though his eyes stayed sharp. Travelers didn't come this far by accident, and women alone, in the middle of nowhere, almost never did. He took a step forward, crunching dry earth beneath his boot. The woman didn't speak. She didn't even raise her head. She swayed in the saddle, like the wind had carved hollows inside her. The horse stumbled. Jacob moved without thinking, grabbing the reins just as she started to slip. "Whoa now!" he muttered to the horse, calming it with a low whistle. His other hand caught her by the arm, steadying her as she slid to the ground. She didn't collapse right away. She tried to stand, straightening her back, as if recalling some lesson in pride, but her legs buckled beneath her. She landed hard on the porch steps, breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Jacob crouched beside her. "Ma'am," he said quietly, almost more to the sky than to her. She blinked, eyes glassy and dry. Her skin was sunburned across the cheeks, cracked at the lips. There was something fierce in her expression. Not fear, but exhaustion married to grit. "I need." Her voice was a rasp, barely louder than the wind. "Water. Please." Jacob looked past her to the saddle, a single satchel, a rolled wool blanket, and beside it, strapped clumsily, a weathered brown suitcase with brass corners and a broken handle. He didn't answer her right away. He was still trying to make sense of what he was seeing, because nestled beside the suitcase, wedged between two leather straps, was a folded piece of paper creased and sweat-stained, but unmistakably official. Marriage contract, if his old eyes were right, and tied around the handle, nearly hidden beneath layers of dust, was a white handkerchief. The name Harlan was embroidered at the edge in faded blue thread. Jacob felt something stir in his chest, an old ache he hadn't named in years. "Eliza?" she said, barely audible. Jacob blinked. Eliza Mae Harlan," she murmured, and then her eyes fluttered shut. Her body slumped forward before he could stop it. He caught her under the arms, easing her down against the porch rail. She weighed next to nothing. Dust lifted off her coat in small clouds with each movement. For a moment, he just knelt there, the rifle forgotten beside him. He should have left her, should have saddled a horse and ridden for the nearest town. Let someone else deal with this sudden complication. But something about her, maybe the way she hadn't begged, hadn't wept, hadn't even tried to explain herself, sat heavy in his chest. This woman hadn't come looking for sympathy. She'd come because she had nowhere else to go. Jacob stood and looked around. The storm had stripped the world bare, and the shadows were growing longer by the minute. Coyotes would be out before dusk. There was no time for questions, and no room for hesitation. He moved quickly, lifting her with surprising ease. She didn't stir. Her head rested against his shoulder, her breath shallow but steady. Inside the cabin, he laid her gently on the old settee near the stove. He grabbed the cleanest rag he could find and wet it from the pump basin, dabbing her forehead, brushing grit from her face. Up close, she looked younger. Not naive, but young in the way people do when they've endured just enough pain to know it won't be their last. He glanced at the suitcase still sitting on the porch, then to the marriage paper, still half folded against it. There was a story here, one he hadn't asked for, but one that had landed, quite literally, on his doorstep. He exhaled deeply, then stood. He walked to the front door, rifle still leaning against the jamb, and for the first time in years, he stepped outside not to check the sky or the fences, but to bring in a stranger's bag. The brass corners were dented, and the latch barely held, but the name on that handkerchief that lingered, Eliza Mae Harlan. He repeated it in his head as he set the suitcase beside her and stoked the fire. Outside, the sun dipped below the ridge, turning the dust into ribbons of copper and rose. Inside, a silence settled not the kind Jacob was used to. This one felt waiting, full of questions, of names, of reasons, of what had been lost and what might still be saved. Jacob looked at her again, pale hands folded in her lap, eyes closed, lips parted slightly in sleep. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel alone. He didn't feel safe, either. But maybe, just maybe, that was the point. She said little, but her silence screamed of something lost, or left behind. When Eliza opened her eyes, the first thing she noticed wasn't the ache in her limbs or the dryness on her tongue. It was the stillness of the room. Not just quiet, but lived-in quiet. A kind of hush that blankets spaces untouched by time or too much company. She blinked slowly, eyes adjusting to the soft lamplight. The ceiling beams above her head were dark with age, and the scent in the air was cedarwood and something faintly medicinal camphor. Perhaps. Her coat was folded neatly over the back of a nearby chair. Her boots sat by the stove, cleaned of dust. A blanket, coarse but warm, had been draped over her. She didn't remember lying down, didn't remember much after asking for water. Her throat burned, but she didn't speak. Instead, she listened to the creak of floorboards nearby, to the muted clink of metal in what must have been a kitchen. Someone moved with care, measured, not hurried, not loud. Then she remembered the man, the one with the steady voice and calloused hands, the one who hadn't asked questions, hadn't flinched when she collapsed. She hadn't caught his name, but there was something in his silence that had felt familiar, like her own. The door opened quietly. He stepped in holding a small tin cup and a folded towel. His eyes met hers, surprised but unreadable. "You're awake," he said, voice low, as if speaking too loud might startle the air. She nodded, trying to sit up. The motion sent a ripple of weakness through her, and she winced. "Easy," he added, crossing the room and handing her the cup. Water, fresh from the pump. She took it with both hands, nodding her thanks before sipping slowly. The cold water hit her throat like rain on scorched earth. "I found you slumped on the porch," he said. "You've been out for hours." "Storm caught me," she said hoarsely. He nodded. It was a bad one. They didn't speak for a while. The quiet settled between them, not uncomfortable, but weighty. Finally, she asked, "This your place?" He glanced around the room. "Has been for about 15 years. You live alone?" "Yes." A pause. "You always help strangers like this." He looked at her, eyes sharp but not unkind. "I don't usually have the chance to." That made her smile, just barely. She handed the cup back. "Thank you." He took it, set it on the table, and turned back. "I'm Jacob Whitmore, Eliza Mae Harlan." He nodded once, the name seeming to root itself somewhere in his chest. "You came from the South." "Yes, near the border, long way, longer than I expected." She didn't explain more. He didn't ask. He stood there for a moment, as if weighing something, then nodded toward the hallway behind her. "I've got a room you can use. It's clean. Has a proper bed." She didn't move. "You sure it's the only one with a door that shuts?" Eliza didn't ask what the other rooms were for. She let him help her up, her legs still unsteady. He guided her with care, not touching her more than necessary, but never letting her stumble. The room he showed her was small but tidy. A faded quilt covered the bed. A ceramic basin sat on the dresser beside a brush, with hair still tangled in its bristles. There was a shelf with 3 books, and a lace curtain that moved softly in the breeze from the cracked window. She turned slowly, taking it all in. "This belonged to someone else," she said. He hesitated. "Yes." "Your wife." He nodded, eyes distant. 10 years gone. She ran her fingers over the dresser edge. "You've kept it like she just stepped out for a moment." Jacob said nothing. He didn't have to. "I don't mean to intrude," Eliza added. "You're not—" She looked at him, searching his face for a flicker of anything: anger, grief, resistance. But there was only calm acceptance, like he'd made peace with this choice long before she ever arrived. "I won't touch anything," she whispered. "You don't have to promise that." And with that, he left her alone. She washed her face, brushed her hair with gentle strokes, and changed into a fresh blouse from her suitcase one that hadn't seen sunlight in weeks. She folded her dusty coat over the chair, laid the embroidered handkerchief on the nightstand, and climbed into bed. The sheets smelled faintly of lavender. As the sun dipped below the canyon's edge, shadows stretched across the room. Outside, the night fell slow and deliberate. And then she heard it, soft strumming, low and imperfect, but full of ache. A guitar, old and slightly out of tune, but played with the kind of care one only gives to something that matters. Jacob was singing, no words, just humming now and then, the kind of song that never had lyrics to begin with, the kind of music made by someone who didn't expect anyone to hear. Eliza lay still, listening. It was the loneliest sound she'd ever heard, and somehow, it made her feel less alone. Some rooms hold more ghosts than furniture. Eliza woke before the sun, the kind of waking that doesn't come from rest, but from a deep, unrelenting awareness of place, of memory, of the sheer strangeness of finding oneself safe after days of not being. The room was cool. The quilt had slipped halfway to the floor during the night, revealing sheets worn soft from time and use. She sat up slowly, letting her bare feet touch the wooden boards, which creaked gently beneath her weight. The floor, like the air, held a kind of hush reverent, as if the room still remembered someone else's footsteps. She took a long breath and looked around, really looked. This had been Clara Whitmore's room. That much was clear, not from anything Jacob had said, but from the details left untouched. The brush with loose, long auburn hairs still in it. The small porcelain perfume bottle with dried lavender at its base. A pair of neatly folded gloves on the dresser, delicate and yellowed with time. Eliza rose and crossed to the wardrobe, hesitating before pulling it open. The hinges gave a soft sigh. Inside hung only one dress, a deep green calico, simple but elegant, with lace trim at the collar. Dust clung to its folds like memory. She reached out, fingers grazing the fabric. It was heavier than it looked, the weight of it, speaking of another life, a woman who once wore it to church, maybe, or to sit beside her husband at town gatherings. Eliza imagined the dress catching a breeze as Clara spun once, laughing, barefoot in the summer grass. Without quite knowing why, Eliza lifted the dress carefully off its hanger. She folded it slowly, smoothing the fabric with her palms before laying it on the bed. Then she dusted the inside of the wardrobe, the top of the dresser, the window sill. She didn't move things. She didn't rearrange. She simply tended, like one might tend to a grave, not to disturb, but to show respect. Down the hallway, she heard footsteps, then the soft clink of a kettle placed on the stove. Jacob was up. When she stepped into the kitchen, her blouse tucked neatly and her hair brushed into a simple braid, Jacob looked up from the counter. He paused, holding a tin cup mid-air. "You didn't have to clean anything," he said. "I didn't just dusted?" He nodded slowly, setting the cup down. "I folded the dress," she added. "I hope that was all right." Jacob's eyes flickered. Not surprise, not anger, just a quiet ache, a ripple of memory behind his weathered gaze. "It's been hanging there 10 years, he said. "Never could bring myself to fold it. Thank you." They stood in the silence that followed, neither quite knowing what to say next. Eliza moved toward the small table and pulled out a chair. "Do you always let strangers sleep in that room?" "No." She met his eyes. "You're not a stranger anymore." That stopped her for a moment. Then she glanced down, running her fingers along the wood grain of the table. "I should tell you something," she said. Jacob poured coffee into 2 cups and sat across from her. "I didn't just get caught in the storm," she began, voice even, careful. "I came out this way to meet a man." He nodded but didn't interrupt. His name was Merrill Cates, owned a dry goods store in a border town called Esperanza. We'd been writing back and forth since autumn. He said he wanted a wife, someone who could help run things, cook, keep the books. She paused, taking the cup in both hands, though she didn't drink. "I sold what I had, bought a train ticket, got off at the last stop before Mexico, and hired a wagon the rest of the way." Jacob's voice came gently. "Did you find him?" Eliza's lips twitched something between a smile and a flinch. "I found him," she said, "but he'd already married someone else, just 2 weeks prior." Jacob didn't react. No raised brows, no sharp exclamations. He just looked at her, like a man watching weather move in. "I had nowhere to go," she continued. "Didn't have enough money for a room in town, and when the boarding house filled up, I figured I'd try to head north and see where the road took me." "That's quite a road to take," Jacob said after a pause. "It wasn't bravery," she replied. "It was necessity." He sipped his coffee. "Sometimes those are the same thing." She looked at him, uncertain whether to believe that. Jacob leaned back in his chair, setting his cup down. "Well," he said, "you're here now, and here. You don't need to be in a hurry." Something in her chest loosened, not quite relief, but the absence of something tighter. She nodded. "Thank you," she said softly. The words weren't enough, but they were all she had. Jacob stood, motioning toward the pantry. "If you know your way around a kitchen, I'll get out of your way." Eliza raised an eyebrow. "You trusting me already?" He half smiled. "I trust good coffee, and you didn't mess that up." She rose, tying her hair back tighter and rolling her sleeves. "I haven't cooked in weeks," she said, reaching for a tin of flour. "Might burn the whole place down. If you do, just aim it toward the barn," he said over his shoulder as he walked outside. Eliza laughed, quiet but real. By mid-morning, the scent of baking bread drifted through the cabin like something sacred. It had been 10 years since Jacob had smelled anything like it in his home. 10 long years of dried beans, salted meat, and canned peaches. But now there was yeast and butter, and the soft sound of hands shaping dough against a floured counter. And for the first time since Clara's passing, Jacob didn't eat alone. It wasn't the coffee, it was the company that made it taste like home. The morning air still carried a chill, but the kitchen was warm, not just from the fire or the bread that cooled on the windowsill, but from the presence of something that had long been missing: conversation, movement, another soul. Eliza sat at the table, hands wrapped around a chipped blue mug. Jacob poured her coffee from the enamel pot, then filled his own. He didn't ask how she liked it. She didn't offer, somehow. They both seemed to understand this wasn't the kind of place for preferences. It was for presence. She took a sip and glanced toward the open window. "This tastes better today," she said, softly. Jacob grunted, "Same beans." She smiled. "Maybe it's just the company." He didn't respond, but his lips curved slightly before he took a long drink. By now, Eliza had been there for 4 days. 4 sunrises of rising early, brushing out her hair with Clara's old comb, pulling back the curtains to let in light that hadn't touched these rooms in years. She moved quietly, never intruding, never assuming, but always seeing what needed doing. The pantry, once cluttered with half-used tins and forgotten jars, now stood organized. Dried herbs hung from the beam near the window. The floors, swept daily, glowed faintly with a layer of oil she'd found in a back cabinet. She had stitched the torn curtain in the front room, not because anyone asked, just because it bothered her that it hung crooked. Jacob, in turn, had started spending more time outside not to avoid her, but to busy his hands. He brought out the old wagon, long since covered with a tarp and dust, and began oiling the axles. He replaced 2 of the wheels, cleaned the harnesses. When Eliza asked why, he shrugged and said, "Figured it might be useful someday." She hadn't asked more, but she knew, and that knowledge settled somewhere both comforting and sad. One evening, as the light faded and supper cooled between them, she looked across the table at him. "Did you serve?" she asked gently. Jacob didn't flinch. "Union Army, infantry, how long, from the start to the end?" She nodded. "You came back alone? I came back different." There was no bitterness in his voice, but the weight of the words hung there like smoke. "I taught school," she offered after a moment. He looked up, surprised. In a small town outside Topeka. 1 room, 28 students, ages 6 to 14. That's a handful. You have no idea. She smiled. Had a boy once try to smuggle a chicken under his coat. Said it was for show and tell. Jacob chuckled. It was low and short, like he wasn't used to letting sound out that way. But it warmed the room more than the stove ever had. "You miss it?" he asked. "Every day." Her voice faltered, just a bit. "But once I hit 29 and still hadn't taken a husband, the school board thought I was a poor example." Jacob's brow furrowed. "So they let you go. More like nudge me out with enough guilt to last a lifetime." He leaned back, folding his arms. "You deserved better." She shrugged. "I wanted a place, a life, not just to exist between other people's rules." They sat in silence for a while, the kind that grows between people who've shared truths they don't often speak aloud. Outside, the crickets began their nightly chorus. The wind shifted through the cottonwoods, and the horses shuffled in the corral. Then Eliza broke the quiet. "When you finish fixing that wagon," she said, not looking at him, "where do you think I should go?" Jacob didn't answer right away. He stared into his cup, then glanced toward the window as if it might offer something helpful. "Wherever you want," he said finally. She looked up. "And where would you go, if you were me?" He met her gaze. "I'm not you. No. But you know this land. These people. You've seen what happens to women out here alone." He didn't flinch. "You're not alone." That silenced her. Not because it wasn't true, but because it was. She stood then, quietly gathering the plates. Her back was straight, her steps sure, but he noticed the way her shoulders stiffened like she was holding something in, something fragile. Jacob watched her move, his chest heavy with something he hadn't felt in years. Not longing, not desire, just the ache of someone remembering what it meant to care. Some letters stay unsent not because we forget, but because we're too afraid to hope. The mornings in early summer came with a kind of hush that felt borrowed soft light, gentle breeze, and the long shadows of decisions yet to be made. Eliza had begun rising before Jacob, not out of obligation, but out of restlessness. There was something inside her that couldn't quite settle, even as the world around her began to feel strangely steady. It had been 2 weeks since she arrived. 2 weeks of quiet breakfasts and gentle chores, of shared silences and half-spoken memories. The days followed a rhythm she hadn't realized she missed, a rhythm not built on fear or necessity, but on ordinary kindness. And yet, even in this newfound peace, a folded piece of paper in the bottom of her satchel hummed like a wasp behind a curtain. She had found it tucked into a parcel that had been forwarded from the last boarding house in Kansas, a letter, ink slightly smudged, addressed in her mother's delicate hand. Eliza, if this finds you, I won't have long. The doctor says not many days remain. I've told the Reverend you may not come, but still, I hope. I think of your hair in the sunlight. I think of how quiet you were as a child, always watching, always farther away than the others. If you can, come home. Love. Mama Eliza had read the letter only once. She hadn't cried then. She had just folded it carefully, placed it at the bottom of her bag, and pressed her hand flat on top of it as if that would keep the ache from rising. She hadn't told Jacob. She didn't know how. Or maybe she did, and just wasn't ready to hear his answer. Because if he said go, she would have to choose. And if he said stay, she might listen. That evening, Jacob had gone to check the fence line. She stayed behind to finish folding laundry, well-worn linens she'd washed by hand and dried in the sun. As she carried the last stack into the bedroom, the latch on her suitcase gave way. It had always been temperamental, held together more by habit than function. The top flipped open and the contents shifted: a spare dress, a hand mirror, a small tin of buttons, and the letter. It fluttered to the floor, landing face up. Jacob returned not long after, dust on his boots and the kind of tired that comes more from thinking than walking. He saw the open suitcase, the scattered belongings, and bent down to help gather them. That's when he saw it. He didn't pick it up, just paused, eyes scanning the words, enough to understand, not enough to betray. Eliza turned the corner and froze. Their eyes met. No words passed, just breath, heavy between them. She stepped forward, picked up the letter, and tucked it back into the case without explanation. Jacob stood. His hands were empty. I didn't mean to, he began. I know. You don't have to explain. I wasn't going to. He nodded once. The moment stretched between them, taut but unbroken. If you need a horse, he said quietly, I'll ready one for you. I haven't decided. Jacob's brow furrowed, not in frustration but in that subtle way he had of hiding concern behind practicality. You still have time, he said. I might not, she replied, more to herself than to him. And with that, she turned and walked to the porch. That night, neither of them said much over dinner. The fire burned low. The wind outside had stilled, but something between them had shifted, not broken, not yet, but changed. At dawn, Eliza sat at the small desk in the front room, the one Clara used to keep her recipe cards and needlework patterns in. A clean sheet of paper lay before her, the pen held tightly in her hand. She stared at the page for a long while before writing. Dear Mr. Whitmore, you didn't ask for me to stay. You didn't ask for me to leave, but you gave me the first quiet I've felt in years. You gave me room to be something other than disappointed. I don't know yet what that means, but I wanted to say thank you. Her hand trembled slightly. A drop of ink blurred one of the letters, not from the pen, but from the tear that followed it. She folded the letter, laid it flat beneath the lamp, and stepped outside. The sun was barely rising, casting a golden line across the ridges. Today, she would make a decision, but not just yet. Goodbyes often start in the silence between two people who care too much to speak first. The sky hadn't yet softened into dawn, but Eliza was already dressed, her boots laced, her satchel packed. The cabin was still, save for the occasional creak of old timber shifting in the cool air. She moved quietly, like someone tiptoeing through a memory that didn't belong to her. Every footstep on the floor felt like it might wake something deeper than Jacob, something that lived in the walls, in the quilt still warm from her sleep, in the chair by the stove where she'd once sat and dared to laugh. She didn't need much. She had never carried a life that required much weight, just the suitcase, the satchel, and a few pieces of herself she hadn't yet lost. The handkerchief came last. She stood at the kitchen table, fingers brushing the soft, frayed edge. The embroidery was faded now, Harlan stitched in thread once sky blue, now dulled to the color of old lake water. It had been her mother's once, and then hers. A reminder of where she'd come from. A name that had meant something before it had meant only lost things. She folded it carefully and placed it in the center of the table. A quiet goodbye. Not a demand, not a plea, just presence. She paused then, letting her gaze drift across the room one final time. The fire in the stove had gone out hours ago, but the warmth lingered. A worn deck of playing cards still sat near the window, where Jacob sometimes played solitaire after supper. The boots by the door, always aligned with quiet discipline. The coat rack with only one hat. She let it all settle inside her, piece by piece, like packing memories into a place she couldn't carry. Then she opened the door gently and stepped out into the cold morning air. The sky was beginning to shift from black to navy. The horses stirred as she approached, and she shushed them softly, reaching for the saddle she'd prepped the night before. She didn't expect him to be awake, but Jacob Whitmore had always been a man who rose before the sun. He stood in the doorway, the light behind him casting his frame into shadow. He said nothing at first. Just watched her work the cinch strap with shaking hands she tried to steady. Their eyes met over the horse's back. No accusation, no surprise, only knowing. "You're up early," she said quietly. "So are you." She nodded once and turned back to the saddle, tugging one last strap. "I was going to leave a note. I saw the handkerchief. I figured you'd understand." He stepped forward, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. "I do." She ran her hand along the horse's mane, the motion more for her than for the animal. "I need to see her. My mother." Jacob's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice stayed level. "You should." Eliza didn't look at him. Couldn't. This place. She started, then faltered. "It's not something I expected." "Neither were you," he said gently. That made her smile. Just barely. The kind of smile that breaks before it fully forms. "I didn't mean to stay this long. I didn't mean to want you to." The silence that followed was thick with all the things they wouldn't say. All the things that wouldn't make a difference now. She stepped away from the horse, standing before him now. Not close enough to touch, but close enough to feel. "I don't know if I'll be back," she whispered. "I won't ask you to be." She nodded, but her eyes said she wanted him to. Jacob looked down for a moment, as if searching the dirt for answers. When he looked back up, there was something softer in his expression. Not resignation, not hope, just truth. "There's always a place here for you." Her breath caught. She didn't cry. Not yet. But her lips trembled, and her eyes shimmered in the pale light of morning. "I know," she said. Then she turned, mounted the horse, and with a final glance half farewell, half promise, she rode toward the ridge. Jacob stood where she'd left him, arms at his sides, heart loud in his chest. He didn't move until she disappeared behind the rise. And even then, he didn't go back inside. He just stood there, watching the place where she'd been, letting the silence take shape again, not the old silence of loss, but a newer one. A silence that held something different now, something waiting. And in the faintest breeze that brushed past his coat, he could almost hear her voice lingering in the air, soft, uncertain, but still echoing. "I know. Sometimes going home means facing a place that never felt like home at all." Kansas smelled like damp earth and old wood. The air was heavier than she remembered, thick with summer rain and the scent of lilacs gone to seed. Eliza stepped off the wagon at the edge of the town she hadn't seen in nearly 3 years. Her boots touching the familiar ground, like a question she wasn't sure she wanted answered. The buildings looked smaller now, more tired. The general store still had the same creaky sign, the same faded advertisement for whorehound drops in the window. Children she didn't recognize ran barefoot down the main street. No one turned to look at her. It was like she'd never existed here at all. The house sat at the edge of town, tucked behind two gnarled sycamore trees and a rusting gate. The garden was overgrown, the path to the porch broken in places by root and time. But the curtains in the front room still moved with the breeze, and the front door creaked just the same. Inside, everything was exactly where it had always been. That was the hardest part. Her mother lay in a narrow bed near the window, face drawn, hands folded gently over a quilt. Eliza remembered from childhood faded red patches stitched with uneven lines and love. A woman from the church sat beside her, reading aloud from Psalms. She looked up when Eliza entered, nodded once, and quietly left. Eliza sat down. Her mother opened her eyes slowly, pupils cloudy, breath shallow. Eliza? Her voice was dry, brittle as autumn leaves. You came? Eliza reached for her hand, took it carefully between her own. I did. They didn't say much after that. The silence was softer than the ones they'd shared in the past, less guarded, more surrendered. Eliza didn't ask why her mother had written after so many years of absence. Her mother didn't ask where Eliza had been or what had gone wrong. Some questions no longer matter when time turns thin. By morning, she was gone. Eliza sat with her for a long time after, not crying, not praying, just sitting. Later. The preacher said a few words. A neighbor brought over bread. No one lingered. No one asked why the daughter who'd left so long ago had suddenly returned. In the days that followed, Eliza went through the house, room by room, drawer by drawer. She sorted through the remnants of a life she'd once tried to fit into and never could. The kitchen still held the chipped teacup she used to drink from as a girl. The cupboard still creaked at the same spot near the bottom shelf. In the bedroom, a cedar chest sat beneath the window, its hinges rusted but still functional. She opened it one afternoon, more out of muscle memory than intent. Inside were old letters, linens, a pair of gloves from her mother's youth. At the bottom, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, was a photograph she'd never seen. Her parents, young, wedding day. They stood beneath the church oak tree, her mother in a pale blue dress, her father in his Sunday coat, both squinting at the sun with uncertain smiles, the kind of happiness people wore when they didn't yet know how hard it would all be. Eliza turned the photo over. In faint pencil, someone had written, "Where there is kindness, there is home." She stared at the words until her vision blurred, not because of the handwriting or the sentiment, but because she suddenly realized she'd seen more kindness in a stranger's dusty cabin than in this house where she'd grown up. And that meant something. That had to mean something. That evening, she sat at the same kitchen table where her mother once braided her hair and told her not to speak unless spoken to. She pulled out a piece of stationery, the kind reserved for holiday letters and church announcements. She dipped the pen in ink, hesitated only briefly, and wrote, "Jacob. The garden here is overgrown. The walls are still too quiet. The bed is too soft, and the tea tastes like memory, not comfort. I came back, as I promised. And now I understand that this was never really home. Not because of what it lacked, but because of what it never offered. You did. I'm coming home if the door's still open. Eliza." She folded the letter, sealed it, and addressed it with careful strokes. Then she went to the porch, breathing in the Kansas air one last time. It didn't feel like hers anymore, and maybe it never had. He counted the days in coffee cups and sunrises, each one empty without her. After she left, the house didn't go quiet. It held its breath. Jacob moved through the days like a man not entirely convinced time was still passing. He woke early, poured 2 cups of coffee out of habit, then set one aside. The second cup would cool untouched, a silent placeholder for a presence no longer there. The kitchen remained clean, not because he worked at it, but because Eliza had shown it how to be alive again. The folded towels, the dried herbs, the small jar of wildflowers she'd left on the windowsill. He didn't move any of it. He didn't need to. Instead, he threw himself into fixing what had been broken long before she ever arrived. The barn roof, the back steps, the old wash basin that had leaked for years. He patched, mended, polished. Not to impress anyone, not to prepare for anything, just to move his hands when his mind grew too loud. He replanted Clara's garden, this time with Eliza's touch in mind. Basil, rosemary, thyme, things she'd said she missed, things she'd once reached for automatically as she cooked, as if expecting them to be there. Jacob knelt in the soil, fingers deep in dirt, and whispered her name more times than he'd ever said it aloud. Eliza. The name didn't hurt. It simply hung in the air like something unfinished. Each evening, he sat on the porch, the Harlan handkerchief folded neatly in his shirt pocket. He'd taken to carrying it that way, pressed against his chest, like a quiet promise. It smelled faintly of lavender and smoke. He didn't write her. He didn't know how. What could he say that wouldn't sound like hope? And hope, he'd learned, could be as heavy as sorrow. Then, one crisp morning in early October, a letter came. It arrived in the same plain envelope as the feed catalogs and ranch notices. No return address, just his name. Neatly printed in handwriting he knew better than his own. He didn't open it right away. He stared at it, turned it over in his hands, tucked it into his back pocket, and went out to the barn. It wasn't until after sunset, with the fire crackling low and the stars sharp above the roof, that he sat down at the kitchen table and slit the envelope open. Her words were careful, thoughtful, unrushed. He read them once, then again, then a third time, this time aloud, as if hearing them made them more real. Jacob, the garden here is overgrown. The walls are still too quiet. The bed is too soft, and the tea tastes like memory, not comfort. I came back, as I promised, and now I understand that this was never really home. Not because of what it lacked, but because of what it never offered. You did. I'm coming home if the door's still open. Eliza Jacob folded the letter with trembling hands and placed it beneath the lamp. He didn't write back. He didn't need to. The next morning, he swept the porch, scrubbed the old teapot she'd once joked was beyond saving, and re-stitched the leather strap on the saddle she'd favored during her short stay. Every day afterward, he waited, not anxiously, not desperately, just faithfully. He took to sitting on the porch before supper, eyes scanning the horizon in the same way he once checked for coyotes or broken fences. The difference now was that what he waited for wasn't danger or damage, it was possibility. The season shifted slowly. The cottonwoods turned gold, then bronze, their leaves falling in slow spirals that danced along the ground before disappearing into the dust. October drifted toward November, and then, one late afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the far ridge, he heard it. Hoofbeats, not hurried, not frantic, familiar, rhythmic. His heart stilled. He rose slowly, not out of fear this time, not to grab a rifle or brace for trouble, but with the kind of reverence a man saves for the most sacred of things. He stepped off the porch, hands by his sides, breath held, and there she was, cresting the ridge on horseback, dust trailing behind her like smoke from a story unfinished. She wore her travel coat, her braids swung gently beneath her hat. Her satchel was strapped behind her saddle, and her eyes, those same watchful, guarded, hopeful eyes, found him before her horse even stopped. Jacob didn't speak. He smiled, and this time, she was the one who came home. Sometimes, the only way to find where you belong is to lose everything else first. Eliza didn't dismount right away. She sat on the horse for a few breaths longer, as if giving the moment permission to become real. Dust swirled around her boots. The wind tugged gently at the hem of her coat. Jacob didn't speak. He didn't move toward her, didn't ask why she'd come back or how long she planned to stay. He just waited like he always had, steady, rooted, ready. She swung down from the saddle with practiced ease and let the reins fall. The horse stayed still, as if it too understood that this wasn't just another stop along the way. They faced each other across the space of a few feet and an ocean of things left unsaid. And still, no words passed between them, just eyes two sets tired from waiting, softened by time, sharpened by longing, and something passed in that gaze, something final, something beginning. Jacob stepped aside, held the door open. She walked past him into the cabin like she belonged there. Because she did. The wedding came 2 weeks later, not because of urgency, but because the neighbors started to bring it up, and Eliza, ever practical, decided if folks were going to talk, they might as well have cake while doing it. They married under the cottonwood tree behind the house, the one that Clara had once planted in a hopeful spring long ago. Its branches bowed gently in the autumn air, leaves trembling like witnesses. It wasn't grand. There were no ribbons, no orchestras, no flowers hauled in from town. Just a few chairs, some laughter, and a preacher who arrived late but didn't apologize. The neighbors brought pies, jars of cider, and 2 fiddle players who knew only 3 songs, but played them like they mattered. Eliza wore a simple cream dress someone had found in an old cedar chest. Jacob wore the same black vest he'd worn to his father's funeral. They stood hand in hand, not promising fireworks or poetry, just presence, just the will to stay. When the sun began to set and the guests had gone, leaving only candle stubs and the scent of cider in the air, Jacob and Eliza sat on the front porch in silence. The stars came out one by one, soft and unhurried. Eliza turned toward him, her voice low. "I came here with nowhere else to go," she said, "but now I know I was always meant to arrive." Jacob didn't reply. He simply reached over and took her hand in his thumb brushing the inside of her palm like punctuation. It was all the answer she needed. Years passed. The land, as it always did, changed with the seasons, wilder in some years, softer in others. The house grew into itself again. The garden flourished, full of rosemary, beans, and more tomatoes than either of them could eat. The barn was fixed, the porch re-stained, the kitchen table re-sanded after little hands had carved initials into it during one long summer of mischief. Their lives filled slowly. Evenings spent reading aloud by lamplight. Mornings of quiet chores and shared coffee. Letters from friends in far towns. Laughter from neighbors who became kin. And then, one day, the sound of little feet on old floorboards. A child, then 2, then the kind of chaos that makes life fuller, not messier. They never spoke much about the years before, not because they didn't matter, but because what they had built made those years feel like stepping stones instead of losses. One late afternoon, long after the children had grown and the house had quieted again, Jacob and Eliza sat on the porch, gray-haired and weathered, but warm in the way only time can make a person. Their grandson galloped through the yard on a wooden horse Jacob had carved himself, his laughter echoing off the barn walls. Eliza sipped her tea, rocking gently. Jacob watched the boy for a long moment, then turned to her with a slow, knowing smile. "She didn't just come for shelter," he said softly. "She came to build a life." Eliza looked out at the land that had once been foreign and now was hers, and she smiled because he was right. Sometimes, life doesn't lead us where we planned it, leads us where we're meant to be. Eliza arrived with nothing but a broken promise and a heart heavy with disappointment. Jacob lived in quiet routine, believing the best parts of his life were already behind him. Neither expected a second chance. Yet, it came not as fireworks or grand romance, but as small kindnesses, shared silences, and the courage to stay. This story reminds us that love doesn't always rush in. Sometimes it walks slowly, waits patiently, and grows where it's nurtured. It teaches us that healing can come not from fixing the past, but from building something honest in the present. If you've ever felt lost or too late for love, know this: it's never too late to open your door or your heart. Because belonging isn't about geography or blood. It's about being seen, being safe, and being chosen, exactly as you are. Thank you for spending your time with us today. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like, share it with someone who needs it, and don't forget to subscribe for more timeless tales from the Wild West. Your support keeps these stories alive.